The mysterious arrival. A dark shadow streaked across the sky, cutting through the night like a sharp blade. The people on Earth had no idea what was about to happen. In the silence of the deep, quiet space above, something strange was falling toward their planet. No one could predict it, not even the smartest scientists. It was a ship, a massive one, hurtling toward Earth from a distant galaxy. The ship, shaped like a jagged rock, screamed through the atmosphere, burning up as it entered the Earth's atmosphere. Sparks flew from it as it plummeted toward the ground, making a sound that could be heard for miles. It crashed with a thunderous boom, shaking the Earth beneath it. Dust and debris filled the air, creating a cloud of confusion and fear. It was the kind of event that no one would forget. People panicked. The authorities rushed to the scene, but no one knew what to expect. Among the chaos, there was something that made people stop and stare. From the wreckage, a figure emerged, tall and imposing, wearing armor that gleamed even in the low light. She was like nothing they had ever seen. Her skin was a deep shade of gray, her eyes glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. Her hair was a silvery white, flowing and sharp like a blade. She moved with the confidence of someone who had seen countless battles, someone who had known only victory. Her presence alone made the air seem heavier, charged with power. She was a cosmic executioner, a warrior feared across the galaxy. Her name was Kyra, and she had been sent to Earth for a mission she hadn't expected. The mission wasn't to destroy. It wasn't even to conquer. She was here for something else, something more dangerous than any weapon she had ever held. Zara stood in the middle of the wreckage, looking around, scanning her surroundings. She had landed in the middle of what seemed like a peaceful town, far from any battlefields she had ever known. The silence of the place unnerved her. She was used to the noise of war, the rush of blood in her veins, the cries of enemies falling before her. This was different. This was strange. There was no one here to fight, no one to challenge her. But she wasn't here to fight, at least not yet. Her sensors scanned the area, but the data she received made no sense. This was Earth, a small planet in a backwater part of the galaxy, yet it seemed to hide a power that was unknown to her. As she started walking, she could feel something in the air, something strange and unfamiliar. It wasn't the usual terror or fear that people felt when they saw her. It was something else, something that almost felt peaceful. Confused and cautious, she moved deeper into the town. She felt the ground beneath her, noting its strange softness compared to the planets she had been to before. The buildings were small, simple. The people were smaller than the beings she had encountered on her journeys, and yet she couldn't ignore the strange feeling of being watched. Then, suddenly, she heard it. The sound of footsteps, human footsteps, slow and deliberate. Zara's eyes sharpened as she turned, her hand instinctively reaching for the weapon at her side. But what she saw was not what she expected. A man, an ordinary human, walked toward her. He didn't look afraid. He didn't even look surprised. He just looked curious. He was tall, with dark hair, dressed in simple clothes, but what stood out was the calmness in his eyes. He wasn't running. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't even reaching for a weapon. Instead, he looked at her as if she was just another part of the world, no different from anything else. Zara paused. The human stopped in front of her. The crowd that had gathered behind them, whispering and murmuring, was beginning to get louder, but the two of them remained silent. "Who are you?" the man asked, his voice steady, yet filled with curiosity. His words were simple, yet they carried weight, unlike anything Zara had encountered before. He wasn't afraid of her power. He wasn't afraid of the warrior she was. And that made Zara feel something strange, something she couldn't quite name. Was it curiosity? Was it frustration? "I am Zara," she said slowly, testing the human word with a sense of unfamiliarity. Her voice was cold and commanding, a voice built for the battlefield, meant to instill fear and obedience. But to her surprise, the man didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. "Why are you here?" he asked again, taking a small step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. Zaira hesitated, confused. The mission had been clear. She was to come, find what she was after, and leave. But this human wasn't part of the plan. He wasn't scared. He wasn't bowing to her like all the others. In fact, he was looking at her with an open mind, almost as if he wasn't scared at all. For the first time in years, Zaira wasn't sure how to answer. The silent stare between them stretched on, the tension rising. And for the first time in her life, the executioner, the warrior who had never hesitated before, felt something she didn't expect. Doubt. The crowd grew anxious. Someone in the back shouted, "Run! Get away from her!" But the man remained, standing firmly, his eyes locked onto hers. There was no fear, no hesitation. There was only curiosity, an emotion that Zaira could neither understand nor ignore. This human was different, and she had a feeling that her arrival on Earth was about to lead her into a journey that would change her forever. The next step was uncertain, but one thing was clear: she wasn't going to be alone for long. The human took another step closer, and Zaira, a cosmic executioner, suddenly felt as though the power she had always relied on was slipping from her grasp. The encounter. The man stood still, his eyes unwavering, his posture calm. He was not like any other human Zaira had encountered before. He wasn't afraid of her. He wasn't even concerned with the danger that surrounded them. Instead, he simply regarded her with a kind of detached curiosity, as though she were an interesting puzzle to solve. Zaira, the mighty executioner, was used to commanding respect and obedience. She had walked into countless battlefields, and every enemy had trembled in her presence. Yet this human, he was different. His lack of fear unsettled her, making her question everything she thought she knew about power. The silence between them stretched longer, and the crowd that had gathered around them began to grow restless. The whispers grew louder, but Zaira couldn't take her eyes off the man standing before her. His steady gaze seemed to pierce through her, probing into parts of her she'd long buried. "Why are you not afraid?" she asked, her voice cold but tinged with something else, something unfamiliar. She hadn't meant to sound vulnerable, but the question slipped out before she could stop it. The man didn't flinch, nor did he back away. Instead, he took a small step closer, almost as if the distance between them was simply a matter of curiosity. "Because fear doesn't help," he said. His voice was simple, the words plain, yet they carried weight. Zaira blinked. Fear doesn't help. How could it not? Fear was what controlled the galaxy, what made enemies bend the knee and run. It was the very thing that kept warriors like her at the top of the food chain. Fear was power, or was it? The human didn't seem to need power the way Zaira did. His confidence was not drawn from strength, but from something far subtler, something that Zaira couldn't understand. She felt the grip of her own weapon tighten in her hand. This wasn't supposed to be happening. She was an executioner, a destroyer. What am I becoming? The human spoke again, his voice steady and clear, as though he sensed the inner turmoil Zaira was experiencing. "You came here to find something, didn't you? To take something, or perhaps to destroy it." The words struck her like a physical blow. How did he know? It was true. She had come to Earth with a mission, but that mission was beginning to lose its clarity. What exactly was she supposed to do here? Who was she meant to destroy? What was she meant to take? "I came here because I was ordered to," she replied sharply, though her voice faltered slightly. The truth was, she didn't fully understand her orders anymore. They were starting to feel distant, irrelevant. Ordered by whom? The man pressed, his voice low but insistent. For a moment, Zaira considered the question, but the answer felt evasive, a reflection of her own inner conflict. She had never questioned her masters before, never wondered about the reasons behind the mission she was given. She was an executioner. She took orders, and she carried them out with deadly precision. But now, here on Earth, standing face to face with this man who showed no fear, Her unquestioning obedience felt like a distant memory. Zaira took a step back, her gaze breaking away from the human's steady eyes. What is he trying to do? She had killed without mercy across countless worlds, her hands stained with the blood of the innocent and the guilty alike. But here, in this strange place, in front of this unassuming human, she felt something stir in her that she had never felt before. Doubt. Her thoughts were interrupted as the man took another step toward her. This time, she didn't move. His presence was magnetic, drawing her in despite the warning signals flashing in her mind. She was an executioner. She didn't need to feel anything but control. But in that moment, she wasn't sure of anything. "Why don't you just take it?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost as if the question was meant for her alone. "Take what?" she asked, her voice low, filled with an unfamiliar frustration. "Take whatever it is you came for," he replied simply. "Power, control, conquest. But what happens afterward? After you've taken everything? Is it worth it?" Zaira clenched her jaw, trying to suppress the flood of emotions that were threatening to overwhelm her. This man, this simple human, was making her question the very foundation of her existence. He was making her feel things she had never allowed herself to feel. But his words, they lingered. "What happens afterward? Why do you ask such questions?" she demanded, trying to regain her composure, her voice hard again. "Humans are weak. You know nothing of power." The human looked at her with a quiet intensity, and for the first time, Zaira saw a glimmer of something. Something that wasn't fear, but understanding. He wasn't angry at her. He wasn't challenging her. He was simply asking questions that made her think. "Because," he said gently, "maybe we all need to learn something. Maybe the answer to power isn't in destruction, but in understanding." Zaira's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to deny his words. She wanted to tell him that he was wrong, that she had no need for understanding, that she was beyond it. But she couldn't. The human's gaze softened, and he smiled, but it wasn't a smile of mockery. It was a smile of patience, as if he understood that she was only beginning to see something she hadn't considered before. She didn't know how to respond. For the first time in her life, the mighty executioner had no answer, only silence. And that silence stretched between them, as deep and as unsettling as the vastness of the universe. Zaira felt herself caught in it, as though her very existence was unraveling. But she didn't step away. Instead, she stood there, facing him. The warrior was beginning to question her place in the universe, and it terrified her. The human wasn't afraid of her. He wasn't even afraid of what she might do next. And in that moment, Zaira realized that perhaps the greatest enemy she would ever face wasn't another warrior or some distant galaxy's ruler. It was the human in front of her, forcing her to see the world through a different lens. The first lesson. The first lesson was not one Zaira had expected. She had come to Earth with one purpose: to carry out her mission. She was a warrior, a cosmic executioner, feared throughout the galaxy. She was built to destroy, to conquer. Emotions were irrelevant to her. Power was everything. But the man before her, this human, was starting to make her question everything she thought she knew. She had barely slept since her arrival, too busy pondering the strange, unsettling feelings that had stirred within her since meeting him. His calmness, his unshaken confidence, had started to eat away at her hardened warrior mentality. She could not shake the thought that there was something more to him than met the eye. Zaira found herself back in the quiet town the next day. She had been here for hours, standing still, watching the people move through their daily lives. Nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary, yet everything felt strange to her. She had come to this planet, expecting to be met with fear, trembling at her feet. But instead she saw nothing but curiosity and the faintest traces of kindness. The man, she still didn't know his name, had been gone for a while, but Zaira found herself waiting for him. It was as though she had no control over it. It wasn't like her to be patient. It wasn't like her to care about anything beyond her mission. But here she was, standing in the same spot where they had met, waiting. Then, just as the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow across the town, he appeared, the human man. He was walking toward her again, not with the urgency of someone trying to avoid danger, but with the casual pace of someone who had all the time in the world. "You're still here," he said, his voice almost amused. Zaira nodded silently, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea why she was still standing here. It was as if something invisible was pulling her toward him. She had learned to fight countless battles, to break down enemies without a second thought. But here she stood, unsure of what to do next. "I didn't expect you to return," she said, her voice low and tense, betraying none of the confusion swirling inside her. The human smiled faintly, almost like he was aware of the storm inside her. "I didn't expect you to wait either," he replied simply. Zaira found herself wanting to speak more, wanting to ask why he wasn't afraid of her, why he didn't run from her like all the others. But instead, her words faltered. She didn't understand why this human made her feel so vulnerable. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to being unsure. "Why did you come back?" she asked, her voice a little more forceful than she intended. "I came back because I wanted to show you something," he said, his voice steady, as though everything was under control. "Something that might help you understand why you're feeling the way you are." Zaira raised an eyebrow. "You think you can teach me something?" He nodded. "Maybe not teach, but show you. Sometimes learning comes not from instruction, but from experience." Zaira looked at him, her sharp, glowing eyes searching for any sign of weakness. But there was none. There was no fear, no hesitation. There was only calmness. She was used to facing people who feared her, people who cowered before her might. But this human was different. His presence unsettled her in a way she couldn't describe. "Show me what?" she demanded, though there was a hint of uncertainty in her voice. "Come with me," he said. "Let's take a walk." Zaira stood still for a moment, her mind racing. She wasn't sure why, but something in the way he spoke, in the way he acted, made her feel like she had no choice but to follow him. She nodded, reluctantly. The two of them walked side by side through the streets, but it wasn't like any other walk Zaira had taken before. She was used to traveling through hostile territories, always ready to defend herself, always on alert. But with this human, there was something different. She wasn't on alert. She wasn't prepared to fight. She was learning. As they walked, the human pointed out little things to her, simple observations about Earth that she had never considered before. "You see," he began, "there's strength in the simple things. The trees here, for example, they don't need to fight to grow. They don't need to destroy to survive. They simply exist, and in doing so, they create a balance." Zaira glanced at the trees as they passed. They were tall, strong, and unyielding, their branches reaching toward the sky, yet they didn't fight. They just were. There was something strangely beautiful about it, something she couldn't explain. "You're saying that I should just exist?" she asked, skeptical. The human laughed softly, his eyes glinting with understanding. "Not just exist, but stop thinking that you need to conquer everything. You're not a machine, Zaira. You don't need to destroy to be powerful. There's strength in stillness. There's strength in letting go." Zaira's mind raced. This was not something she had been taught. In every corner of the galaxy, strength was defined by one thing: power. Power through domination. Power through fear. But this human, he was suggesting something completely different, something she had never even considered. They walked for what felt like hours, until they reached a small clearing by a lake. The sun was setting, casting a soft, golden light over the water. The view was peaceful, serene, nothing like the battlefields Zaira had known. "This," the human said, gesturing to the lake, "is strength too. It's not loud, it's not violent, but it's enduring. It doesn't need to prove itself to anyone. It just is." Zaira stared at the water, the silence between them settling in. For the first time in her life, she felt something she had never felt before: peace. But was it weakness? Was peace the same as submission? She didn't know. All she knew was that this human, this simple, calm human, had shown her something she couldn't deny. The first lesson had been planted. For the first time in years, Syra questioned what it meant to be strong. She wasn't sure if she was ready to let go of everything she had known. But one thing was clear: this human had opened her eyes to a whole new world, and for the first time, she was willing to listen. And that scared her more than anything else: unexpected vulnerability. Syra couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed inside her, and she had no idea how to handle it. Since her walk by the lake with the human, her mind had been clouded with questions. Questions about strength, power, and what it truly meant to be alive. The peacefulness of the water, the calmness in the human's voice, and the way he seemed so comfortable in his own skin had all left a lasting impression on her. She, the cosmic executioner, feared nothing, yet here she was, unsure of herself. It had been days since she had seen the human, and she felt an odd sense of emptiness in her chest. She wasn't used to this feeling. She had always been the one to control every situation, to take command with the strength of her will. But now her thoughts were scattered, and that control felt as if it was slipping through her fingers. She found herself walking back to the same town where she had met him. She wasn't sure why, but it felt like the right thing to do. As she moved through the streets, she noticed the simple things that had once seemed irrelevant: the way the wind rustled through the trees, the soft murmur of people talking, the light shining through the windows of the small houses. It all felt so foreign, so peaceful. When she reached the familiar spot near the lake, she found him sitting on the grass, watching the horizon. His calmness was like a beacon, drawing her in. She hesitated for a moment, her warrior instincts screaming for her to stay away, to keep her distance. But something deeper, something unfamiliar, pulled her closer. The human didn't seem surprised when he saw her approach. He merely looked up, his eyes reflecting a knowing warmth. He said nothing, but his gaze invited her to sit beside him. Syra stood still, unsure of what to do. She had never allowed anyone, especially a human, to see her like this, vulnerable, confused, torn between two worlds. But in this moment, she felt an almost unbearable need to understand. She wanted to know what was happening to her. She wanted to understand why she couldn't get rid of the strange, unsettling feeling in her chest. "Why do you keep looking at me like that?" she asked, her voice raw, betraying her internal conflict. The human smiled gently, but there was no mockery in his expression, no sense of triumph. There was only understanding, as though he could see right through her. "Because I see you, Syra. I see beyond the armor, beyond the weapons, beyond the reputation. I see a woman who's searching for something," he said softly. "And you're not alone in that search." Syra's heart skipped a beat. No one had ever spoken to her like this before. The humans she had met in her journeys had always cowered, had always feared her. But this man, he wasn't afraid of her. He wasn't trying to fight her. He was simply looking at her with empathy. "I don't need anyone's pity," Syra snapped, but even she could hear the weakness in her voice. She wasn't used to sounding like this. Defensive, unsure. Her words felt like an attempt to push him away, but they didn't have the usual bite. Instead, they felt hollow. The human didn't respond to her outburst. He simply reached out, gently brushing his hand across the grass beside him, inviting her to sit. Syra stood there for a moment longer, wrestling with herself. She had always prided herself on her strength, on her unshakable resolve. But here she was, standing on the edge of something new, something frightening. Could she allow herself to feel something she had never allowed before? Could she sit with him and let go of her pride, her armor, her reputation? With a deep, reluctant breath, Syra sat down beside him. The moment her body touched the grass, she felt something shift inside her. The ground beneath her felt soft, a stark contrast to the cold, hard surfaces of the world she had known. The quiet, serene atmosphere of Earth wrapped around her like a blanket, soothing her restless mind. For the first time since her arrival, she felt a strange sense of peace. It was disorienting, but she couldn't deny it. The human said nothing. He simply sat there, his presence calm and steady. He didn't need to fill the silence with words, because somehow, the silence itself spoke volumes. For what felt like an eternity, they sat there together, side by side, staring out at the horizon. Thyra felt her muscles relax, her mind slowing. It was as if the tension that had always existed within her, this constant readiness for battle, this drive to conquer, was fading, melting away. But even as she relaxed, a storm still churned inside her. She had spent her entire existence learning to suppress her emotions, to push them aside in favor of strength and domination. She had been trained to believe that vulnerability was a weakness, that showing any emotion would be the same as admitting defeat. But now, with the human beside her, she wasn't sure anymore. "What are you trying to teach me?" she asked, her voice quieter than before, a hint of vulnerability creeping in. The human looked at her, his eyes soft and understanding. "I'm not trying to teach you anything, Thyra. I'm just showing you that you don't have to be everything all the time. You don't have to be a warrior every second. Sometimes, it's okay to just be." Thyra turned her gaze to the ground, her hands trembling slightly as she clenched them into fists. His words echoed in her mind, stirring something she had long buried: doubt. She had always believed that being a warrior, being strong, was the only way to survive. But here, in this moment, surrounded by quiet and calm, she began to wonder if there was another way. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Instead, she simply sat there, feeling a knot tighten in her chest. A strange sensation spread through her, a mix of fear and longing, an emotion she had never allowed herself to feel. For the first time in years, Thyra felt like she didn't have all the answers. And it scared her, but it also, strangely, felt freeing. The human's presence was the anchor she hadn't known she needed. He didn't demand anything from her. He didn't expect her to fight or to conquer. He simply accepted her, as she was, in this strange moment of peace. Thyra closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the sun and the calm of the earth fill her senses. It was a new kind of strength she had never known before. And for the first time, she allowed herself to feel it. Unlikely strength. The days that followed were a blur of quiet moments and uneasy realizations. Thyra could no longer deny it. There was something about the human, something about Earth, that had started to reshape her understanding of the universe. She had spent her entire existence as a cosmic executioner, a warrior whose strength was measured by the number of enemies she had vanquished, the amount of fear she inspired. But now, standing in the middle of this peaceful town, she was beginning to see that perhaps strength could come from somewhere other than destruction. She found herself returning to the lake each day, drawn inexplicably to its stillness, to the calm that it seemed to offer her in a world that had always been filled with chaos. The human was often there too, and though they didn't speak much, his presence was oddly comforting. He never pushed her to talk, never demanded anything. He simply was, patient, observant, and somehow, without even trying, grounding her. But even with all the peace surrounding her, a storm brewed inside Thyra. She was the executioner. She had been trained for battle, not for quiet introspection. Her training had never taught her how to embrace emotions, to accept vulnerability, or to understand the kind of strength that didn't rely on force. It felt like a weakness to her. She wasn't supposed to feel, she was supposed to command. One evening, as the sky blushed with the colors of sunset, the human approached her as she stood on the edge of the lake. His footsteps were soft, barely audible against the whispering grass. She turned, already knowing it was him, his presence unmistakable. "Sarah, you've been distant lately," he said gently, his eyes searching hers. "Is something wrong?" The question caught her off guard. She had expected the usual silence between them, a comfort that allowed her to hide her inner turmoil. But he saw through her, as always. It was as though he could sense the war raging within her, a battle she wasn't ready to fight. "I'm not sure," Kyra admitted, her voice betraying a vulnerability she had long suppressed. Her gaze dropped to the ground, her fists clenching at her sides. "I've spent my entire life being one thing: strong, unshakable. I've built my identity around fear, around control. But here, I'm not sure anymore. Everything feels different." The human stood quietly for a moment, as if absorbing her words, as if understanding the weight of what she had said. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but there was an undeniable firmness to it. "Strength isn't about control, Kyra. It's about resilience. It's about standing tall when everything inside you wants to break, when the world around you wants to tear you apart. Strength is being able to face your fears, your doubts, and still move forward, even if you don't have all the answers." Zyra's heart thudded painfully in her chest. His words struck deeper than she expected. She had been so focused on dominating her surroundings, on bending the universe to her will, that she had never considered the possibility that strength could be something else entirely. His definition of strength felt foreign to her, but it also felt right. "I don't know how to do that," she whispered, the confession slipping from her lips before she could stop it. The human took a step closer, his gaze soft but steady. "It's not something that happens overnight, but it's something you can learn, Kyra. You don't have to be the executioner every day. You can be more. You can be human, in a way. You can learn to find strength in the quiet moments, in the decisions that don't require a weapon." Zyra's hands trembled at her sides. She clenched them tighter, trying to hold on to the familiar feeling of control, but it was slipping like sand through her fingers. She felt so small, so out of place, here on this strange planet, standing before someone who seemed to have everything figured out. "Everything I know tells me I should fight. I should conquer. That's what I was made for," she said, her voice low, almost desperate. "But when I'm with you, I feel like I'm losing myself. I feel like I'm weak." The human's gaze softened, and he gently placed a hand on her shoulder. The simple gesture sent a shock through her, as if a part of her she had long buried had awakened. It was strange, this feeling of being cared for. "You're not weak, Zyra," he said quietly. "You're learning, and learning is the bravest thing a person can do. You're beginning to see that you don't have to control everything. You don't have to fight all the time. You can choose a different way, and that's the greatest strength of all." Zyra looked down at the ground, her mind spinning. She had always believed that to be strong meant to be unyielding, to never back down, to never show weakness. But the human's words were like a revelation, tearing down the walls she had built around herself. Maybe there was more to strength than just the ability to overpower. Maybe true strength came from within, from accepting all parts of herself, even the ones she had spent so long running from. She felt something shift inside her, a crack in the armor she had worn for so long. It wasn't an easy feeling. It was uncomfortable, like being pulled in two directions at once. But for the first time, Zyra didn't feel the need to fight it. She didn't feel the overwhelming urge to push it away. Instead, she let herself sit with it, let it wash over her. The human smiled, sensing the change in her. "It's okay to be uncertain, Zyra. It's okay to question. No one has all the answers. But the journey to finding them, that's where the real strength lies." Zyra's throat tightened. She wanted to say something, but no words came. She simply nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle deep within her. It wasn't just about fighting anymore. It wasn't about power or control. It was about being present, being real. And that was a strength she never thought possible. For the first time, Zyra didn't feel the need to dominate the world around her. She didn't need to conquer or destroy. She just needed to learn. And that, she realized, was the most terrifyingly powerful thing she could ever do. With that realization, Thyra stood a little taller. She wasn't just the cosmic executioner anymore. She was something more. And that was a strength she had never known existed. The test of trust. The night was thick with silence, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves in the wind and the faint hum of the stars above. Thyra had come to appreciate the quiet in a way she hadn't thought possible before. It was here, in this strange peacefulness, that she felt her greatest challenge was beginning to unfold. The warrior who had conquered entire worlds, who had never once questioned her orders, was now standing at the crossroads of a decision she could not avoid any longer. She had spent weeks with the human, days of walking by the lake, talking in soft, measured tones, learning the lessons she never knew she needed. But now something was changing. The danger that had followed her to Earth, the reason for her mission, was no longer a distant threat. It was real, and she had to face it. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice breaking the stillness of the night. She stood at the edge of the lake, the moonlight casting a soft glow on her face. Her gaze was distant, as though the horizon held answers she could not yet grasp. The human was standing beside her, his presence as steady and grounding as it always had been. He had been silent for most of the day, sensing that something was different. He had not pushed her to speak, but now, as Thyra finally spoke, he turned toward her, his expression calm. "What is it?" he asked, his voice gentle, but with a sense of understanding. "I'm not who I was when I first arrived," Thyra said, her words heavy, yet freeing. "You've shown me something I never expected. Strength doesn't come from destroying everything around me. It doesn't come from forcing others to obey." She paused, struggling to find the right words. "But now, the one thing I've always known is being tested. The mission. The reason I came here." The human's gaze didn't waver, though Thyra could sense the question hanging in the air. "What is it that you need to do, Thyra?" Thyra swallowed hard. The words were like stones in her throat, refusing to be spoken. "I was sent here to eliminate a threat, a force that could destroy Earth if left unchecked. I've seen their power, and I know what they're capable of. I'm the one who's supposed to stop it." She felt his gaze shift to the ground, his understanding and concern palpable in the air between them. He wasn't pushing her, but Thyra knew he was waiting for her to make a decision. She had been trained to act, to move without hesitation, to strike down her enemies without mercy. But now she felt the weight of her choices more than ever. "I don't know if I can do it the way I've always done," she continued, her voice quieter now, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. "To fight, to kill, to end lives for the greater good. I've always justified it that way. But now, after everything I've learned here, after seeing how you live, I'm not sure if that's the only way to stop them." The human took a step closer, standing just beside her, but not too close. He didn't push her, he simply allowed her space. "You don't have to fight the way you always have," he said softly. "You have another choice, Thyra. You can find a different way. It might not be easy. It might not be the answer you've always had, but you can find a way to stop them without losing who you are now." Thyra's heart hammered in her chest. The thought of facing the threat without her usual weapons, without her reputation as an executioner, filled her with unease. But at the same time, a spark of hope flickered within her. Could it be possible? Could she stop this threat without sacrificing everything she had known? But there was something else, something that made the decision even more complicated. As she stood there, gazing at the human, she realized something else. He was no longer just a part of her journey. He was a part of her life. She had come to rely on his calm, his guidance, and it terrified her. Could she really walk away from that? Could she risk the bond they had formed, all in the name of duty? "I don't know if I can do this alone," she admitted, her voice almost a whisper. The human's eyes softened, a small reassuring smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You're not alone, Thyra. You don't have to be." Her throat tightened. She had never allowed anyone to be a part of her decisions, especially not in such a personal way. She had always been the one in control, the one who decided who lived and who died. But standing there now, with the human beside her, the thought of losing that connection felt unbearable. "There's a way," she said finally, her voice firmer now. "But it requires trust. Trust in myself. Trust in you. And trust in the possibility that I can still be strong without violence." The human nodded slowly. "That's the hardest part, Akshira. Trusting yourself. Trusting that you can choose a different path. But I believe in you. You don't have to choose what you've always chosen, and you don't have to do it alone." Zyra stood silently for a long moment, staring out at the lake, the moonlight casting reflections on the water. She thought about the countless worlds she had conquered, the battles she had fought. And then she thought about this human, the one person who had shown her that there was another way. Could she really trust herself to walk a new path? Could she abandon the warrior's life she had known for so long? As the night deepened around them, Zyra realized that this was the moment of truth. This was where the executioner had to choose whether to fight with her old ways or find a new strength within herself. The path was unclear, but she wasn't afraid anymore. "I will try," she said, her voice steady now, a newfound resolve building within her. "I'll find a way to stop them, without losing myself." The human placed a hand on her shoulder again, and for the first time, Zyra didn't feel the need to pull away. Instead, she welcomed the connection. She didn't have to face this alone. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, risks, and doubt. But Zyra, the executioner, had learned that true strength didn't always come from destroying your enemies. Sometimes it came from choosing to trust yourself and others, from knowing that even the most powerful warriors had the right to choose a different path. And that path, though uncertain, was now hers to walk. The final lesson. The sky was painted with the first light of dawn, the golden rays creeping over the horizon as Zyra stood at the edge of the town, staring out toward the distant mountains where her enemies were gathering. The time had come. The mission she had come here for, the very reason for her existence as an executioner, was at her doorstep. She had spent so much of her life believing that power came from domination, from crushing those who stood in her way. But now, in the quiet of the morning, she wasn't sure how to approach the challenge ahead. Beside her, the human stood quietly, a silent presence that had become a steady anchor in her life. For the first time, she realized how much she had come to depend on him. He had shown her a different way of being, one not defined by power, but by trust, compassion, and the strength to change. The journey from a hardened warrior to someone who believed in peace, who believed in finding a way that didn't involve violence, had been long and difficult. But she had come so far, and now it was time to test if she could truly follow through with the lessons she had learned. "You're still here," Zyra said softly, her voice carrying the weight of her uncertainty. The human turned to look at her, his expression unchanged. "I told you that you wouldn't be alone, Zyra," he said simply. "You don't have to do this the way you've always done. You have a choice." Zyra looked back at the distant mountains, her mind filled with the faces of those who had come to threaten Earth. She could hear the battle cries in her mind, the echoes of violence that had been with her for so long. She had trained to be the best warrior, the one who would bring down entire civilizations if the need arose. She had been feared. She had been respected. But now, she was torn. Could she still carry the same conviction into this battle without abandoning the person she had become? "I don't know if I can do this," Zyra confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're powerful. They're ruthless. They don't care about peace or understanding. How can I stand against that without becoming who I was before?" The human stood silently for a moment, then reached out, gently placing a hand on her arm. "You've already made the hardest decision, Zyra. You've chosen a path that doesn't require destruction. You've already shown that you can change. Now you just need to trust that you've got everything you need to stop them." Zyra took a deep breath, closing her eyes as she let the words sink in. She had always relied on her strength, on her ability to destroy. But now she was learning that true power came from the choices she made. She had spent so many years fighting with her fists, with weapons, with rage. But in her heart, she knew there was another way. "I can't do it alone," Syra said, her voice faltering. "I've never done it alone before." The human smiled. "You're not alone. You never have been." He glanced at the town behind them, where the people had started to wake up and go about their day. "Your strength, the strength you found here, is inside you, and it's in the people who care about you. They're counting on you, but they're not expecting the same warrior you were. They're expecting the person you've become." Syra's mind flashed to the faces of the humans in the town, the ones she had watched from the shadows. They didn't fear her anymore. They didn't look at her with trembling eyes or bow before her. Instead, they regarded her as someone who had a purpose, someone who could help them, not destroy them. For a long time, Syra had thought her purpose was to be a weapon, to be the one who laid waste to those who dared to stand in her way. But now she understood that her true purpose wasn't just to fight. It was to protect, to choose a path that didn't involve violence, to find a way to stop the coming storm without destroying everything in its wake. "Maybe I can do this," Syra said, her voice stronger now, as the weight of her decision began to settle in. "Maybe I can find another way." The human nodded, his expression filled with pride. "I know you can. I always knew you would." With a final glance toward the horizon, Syra made her decision. She wasn't going to fight this battle the way she had always fought battles before. She wasn't going to use her weapon to end lives or bring pain. Instead, she would use her strength to unite, to find a solution that didn't involve destruction. The enemy that had come to Earth was ruthless, but they had underestimated the humans, and they had underestimated Syra. With one last deep breath, Syra turned away from the horizon and began to walk toward the town. Her feet moved steadily, each step bringing her closer to the moment of truth. The human was by her side, walking quietly with her. He didn't need to say anything more. He knew that Syra had already made the choice she needed to make. When they reached the town, the people gathered around, their faces filled with uncertainty. But when Syra stood before them, her expression calm, her posture steady, they looked at her differently. She wasn't the cosmic executioner anymore. She wasn't the warrior who struck fear into the hearts of her enemies. She was something else now, someone who had learned to find strength in peace, in trust, and in understanding. "I'm here," Syra said to the crowd, her voice clear and confident. "And I will help you. We don't need to fight to win. We don't need to destroy to survive. I found another way. And together, we will stand." The people stared at her, their fear slowly fading away as they saw the strength in her eyes. They had heard of her reputation, but now they saw the truth. She was no longer an executioner. She was a protector, the leader. And together, they would face whatever came their way, not with violence, but with unity. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the promise of a new beginning. Syra knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, and doubts. But for the first time in her life, she didn't feel the need to fight alone. She didn't have to conquer everything. She just had to believe in the strength of the choices she had made. And as the people of the town gathered around her, Syra realized that she had found something far more powerful than any weapon. She had found trust, and in that trust, she had found her true strength.